So let's pick up again. It was only half an hour ago, so probably you remember where we left off. We had just put down a candidate construction for a succinct argument. So now what I want to do is I want to spend maybe just a couple of minutes just remarking on the fact that it, from a syntactical perspective, it does fulfill the sort of goal of a succinct communication complexity and verification time. And then I want to say a little bit about the way you analyze the security of this construction. So let's just do it quickly. Communication-wise, what do we see? Well, we see a hash function, that says size poly in a security parameter, so that's definitely within our budget. We see a output of a hash function, easy, right? So far, we are still within budget. We see randomness. We said that's poly log t. Okay, and then we see answers to the queries. Okay, so the communication complexity of this particular construction depends on the query complexity of your PCP. So if your PCP will have crappy communication complexity, then you will inherit that crappiness over here. Conversely, if you achieve pretty good query complexity, for example, poly log t, then we're still within budget here. Okay, what else do we have? You have the authentication paths. Okay, so you have an additional dependence here. The path is as long as the path is. And how long is it? Well, in a Merkle tree, the length of the path will be logarithmic in the number of leaves, right? So here we have a dependency on the length of the proof, okay? But because the proof is polynomial, okay, the depth of a Merkle tree built over it will be logarithmic in t, okay? So here you will have log t long paths. Each element in the path is a digest, so an output of a hash function. So that's poly k. So overall, here we see that we are achieving our goal of poly in a security parameter and log t. Okay. So that's one aspect. Now let's look at the time complexity of the constructed prover and constructed verifier. Over here, well, the argument prover is running the PCP prover. Okay, so you better make sure that that thing runs efficiently. Okay, and then you're building a Merkle tree over the proof. This is a linear time. When you build a Merkle tree, the number of leaves in the Merkle tree is linear in the number of so the number of nodes in the Merkle tree, the number of hash invocations is linear in number of leaves. Okay, so you will be doing O of size of pi invocations of the hash function. Okay. So the hash function will take you, poly k, right? So these are the two dominating factors, okay? And really, you should think about this as the bigger dominating one, right? So here, once you have the proof, you're just basically hashing it down to a root, okay? The point is that overall, here, well, I didn't really say that, but the point is that we have an efficient, honest prover, okay? On the verifier side, what is the verifier doing? It's sampling a hash function that ought to be easy. Samples the randomness, probably easier. Checking the paths. So the verifier does have a dependence on the proof length, but it's logarithmic, right? So you have some poly k log t cost here to check all the paths. And then you're just running the verifier, really like natively plain text in sort of plain text computation for the PCP. So if this one is fast, then so will this be. Okay, and we started with a PCP where the verifier is fast. By the way, this construction is, of course, interesting even for PCPs where the verifier is not fast, right? Because you will still get small communication complexity. So in general, there's a wide range of settings of parameters where if you plug in a PCP into this construction, you will get something interesting. Okay. In particular, it is interesting for these settings of parameters, but don't take them religiously. It's like just I wrote this down so that they match up with these over here. Okay. Fine. Any questions about the efficiency aspects of this construction? Okay. The only reason why we kind of went through it explicitly is just so that I think the construction, you'll feel it in your hand, not just see it. Okay.
So do you want to say anything about concrete performance?
I will remark later more about this, but let's just say that if this construction is not efficient, it's not due to Killian. It's due to the PCP itself. Okay, so let's put it in a different way. The cryptographic overheads over the underlying information theoretic object are really embarrassingly small and simple. You're just doing some hashing on top of some information theoretic object. This is like incredibly fast, or at least as fast as the underlying object. And really, it is an open research direction to construct concretely efficient PCPs. I'll come back to that later. There are ways around this. But it's not Killian's fault. His construction is beautiful. If we had very good PCPs, this thing would run, very fast.
His fault is leaving the field.
Excuse me?
His fault is leaving the field.
Yeah. So maybe, had he not left the field, maybe he would have gone back and fixed this tiny issue. So, as elegantly as his, yeah.
From non-cryptographer,
Yeah.
If we take the hash function, the family to be universal, why I cannot think of it as probabilistic without thinking too much about a parameter, security parameter and stuff like this? Why it's not simply probabilistic?
So you're saying, suppose I take some, pairwise independent hash function, like, Carter-Wegman style,
Yes,
right?
Yes.
The problem is that in those cases, what's important is that you sample the hash function after the data has been fixed, right? But here the data is up to the control of the prover. So if the prover first sees the hash function and then chooses, how to build the Merkle tree as a function of it, then it will be able to create collisions, because the Carter-Wegman style construction says that you first fix the data, then you pick the hash function, and it says that over the probability of the hash function, collisions don't happen. But in fact, for actual constructions of Carter-Wegman style, you can easily compute collisions very efficiently, rather. Okay, it's a good question.
So if the verifier is not as efficient as in the original PCP, can we try to recursively apply this trick to make this even better? So instead of just running the verifier as it is, we can potentially ask the prover to
prove that, yes. And in fact, I should say, give more credit to Killian in the sense that in his paper, he not only laid out this protocol, but his goal was actually to obtain efficient zero-knowledge arguments. And intuitively, the way he achieves that is that the protocol doesn't really stop here. Instead, there is an additional round where the prover proves in zero knowledge that this thing would have accepted. Okay, roughly. So, and in particular, you can also use it for efficiency. For example, you could try to continue and then, prove a new theorem about this computation. Good question. Okay, so let's try to analyze this one. I think there's something interesting going on in the proof security. So we're going to prove that if some efficient p tilde convinces v of x, so I'm going to use, at this point, there isn't really no reason for me to make explicit this instance AZT. I will just call it x, okay? Convinces v of x with probability delta. Then there exists some PCP pi tilde, capital pi tilde, that convinces v sub PCP with probability, I hope I didn't mess up the computations last night, but something like delta minus negligible, and hopefully you will correct me if I mess up somewhere. Now, I want to say that this is the main thing that we want to try to prove, that if there's some argument prover that convinces the argument verifier with some probability, okay, then it is because he is thinking of some PCP that makes the PCP verifier accept with some related probability, okay? Okay, so this basically proves soundness, right? Because the soundness of the PCP might say that there doesn't exist a PCP that makes the verifier accept with high enough probability, so we are wrong to assume that such an efficient PCP exists.
Shouldn't there be some complexity assumptions there?
Complexity. Yeah. If H is collision resistant, thank you. Yeah, in fact, let me just say it explicitly. We have used cryptography in here because we're assuming there's a collision resistant hash function. This is cryptography because you cannot achieve this property against unbounded provers because we are using, I didn't make it explicit, but in a Merkle tree, you need to use a hash function whose output is shorter than the input. And necessarily collisions exist. Okay? So we have no chance to achieve this property for compressing hash functions against unbounded adversaries. Okay? And if you do not achieve this property, then you can mess with the Merkle tree and cheat when you reveal. Okay? And basically conduct, in a bit harder way, attacks such as the ones that were possible here without the commitment. Okay? So yeah, this lemma is unassuming the hash function is secure. Thank you. Now, what is interesting about this lemma is the fact that where are we going to find capital pi tilde? We are running prover p tilde, right? It convinces the verifier, but the prover is barely saying anything. Like, here it is, he's running, he's convincing the verifier. And what do we see? He says a root, then, some randomness, and then, 5 answers. And what I really need to do, I need to somehow reduce to the security of the PCP. But for that, I need to somehow exhibit this enormous proof that satisfies some property. So somewhere in the security reduction, I need to kind of figure out what is the rest of the PCP. Okay? I can't just run the prover once and kind of use it to kind of construct a PCP. I'm going to have to run the prover actually many times. Okay? Somehow, I need to extract a good pi tilde from the prover's head. Okay? Is it clear? There's something kind of usually non-trivial that happens in succinct arguments because there is some big object that is supposed to live in the prover's head, but what you see it in a protocol execution is actually a tiny sliver of it. Okay? And you have to kind of recover the rest. Okay? So we need to so-called extract pi tilde from p tilde, okay? And okay, once you realize this is what you want to do, then kind of strategy is kind of clear. You are going to take your pi tilde and you send it, for now we'll just say some h, I'll be precise about which h in a moment. On this h, he will say some root. Here it is. And now, basically, we want to try to kind of pause the execution here and then consider all possible continuations or many possible continuations, okay, for possible choices of randomness R. Okay, so I'm going to say R, and we have here the answers and the paths. Okay. Again, for the same hash function, he's going to say some root, and then I'm going to consider multiple possible terminations of this execution. Okay? Now, I'm going to make a simple simplifying assumption. It's not really necessary. I'm going to assume that the total number of possible random coins is actually poly t. Okay? Doesn't have to be necessarily, but if you're careful, you can make it. So for now, I'm going to assume that in my security reduction, I can actually materialize all possible random choices. And I'm going to gather all possible answers that the prover would say after saying this root. Okay? By the way, why am I fixing the same h? What would happen if I change my h? He changes his root, right? So I need to kind of fix a particular root. Okay, so this depends. It's a root that depends on h necessarily, right? Because it's an answer to h.
But if the number of random coins is just poly t, then the prover might just answer you for just one of those random choices, and delta would be 1 over poly t, right?
So I want to relate. I'm going to talk about this in a moment. Okay, but roughly speaking, if the prover convinces me with probability delta, then there must be, some choice of H for which the marginal probability that he convinces me later across all R's is delta, right? So it cannot be that he convinces me overall with probability delta, and there is no choice of H for which a delta fraction of R leads to good things, right? Otherwise, he would not have achieved that, okay? So we're going to consider all possible replies to, or rather, we're going to consider the replies to all possible R's, okay? So for any given H and root, and I do this procedure, I have two outcomes. Either once I consider all the possible replies, I find a collision somewhere, or I don't. There's no other options, okay? So case one, there's a collision somewhere. What does it mean they have a collision somewhere? It means that maybe there is R and R prime for which there is the same location of the proof that is queried, okay? And then two different values are claimed, right? So somewhere up on the path from the leaf to the root, there must be a collision. That's kind of the way you analyze the collision resistance of Merkle trees. And case two is that there are no collisions. Anywhere. Now, in this second case, it means that I can actually define, it's well defined to say that I have a pi tilde that depends on H, right? Because I can actually complete pi tilde, okay? So there are some locations that are never queried, just discard them. I shouldn't keep them around. If there are no collisions, I can define a PCP, okay? Now, let's consider what would happen when I also take a probability over H, okay? If there is a non-negligible probability over the randomness of H that when I do this procedure, I find myself in case one, then I can break the collision resistance of H, okay? So I am here, I find myself here only with probability that is negligible, okay? So most of the time, when I have an H, it will be the case that I can define a PCP. Okay? So here is like, with probability 1 minus negligible. Now, when this happens, this PCP has a certain convincing probability for the PCP verifier. So I can define pi tilde that convinces VPCP with probability, say, epsilon of H. It depends on H, right? Because it depends on the specific PCP, right? And now I'm wondering, could it be the case that this is always small? Not really, right? Because, look, I'm assuming that over the whole probability distribution of H and R, P tilde convinces V of X with probability delta, right? Now, up to a negligible sort of choice of H, I will be able to define a PCP after that, right? And so it must mean that there exists a choice of H such that the probability epsilon of H is at least delta minus negligible, right? This is just by averaging, okay? So conclude that there exists some H in HK such that epsilon to the H is at least delta minus negligible. Because if there isn't, then there is no chance I will ever be able to accumulate so much convincing probability in aggregate. Okay? That's it, right? So this is my pi tilde that I wanted to find. Okay? In fact, there isn't just one H. On average, say, a delta over 2 fraction of choices of H will be such that epsilon of H is at least, say, delta over 2 minus negligible. So in fact, not only there is one choice of H that produces a good PCP, most choices, or rather a good fraction of H's produce a reasonable PCP. So this means I can actually efficiently produce this PCP myself. How do I do it? I sample H myself, and with probability delta over 2, when I do this procedure, I will usually find a PCP that convinces the probability, say, delta over 2 minus
What
negligible.
is your assumption about the relation between the size of W and the size of the space of H? Because you're using H many times. And
I am using H many times.
How big H is?
H is small. It's going to be, so first, let's just be clear, when you build a numerical tree, what you care about is, let's say it's 2 to 1, or not 2 to 1, but 2k to, it's in English, it's really a mess. 2k space 2 space k. That, it halves the output is half the size of the input. And you do use it many times, but sort of all of these H invocations are kind of folded into case 1, in the sense that if I ever find a collision, okay, then I shouldn't be able to find a collision with high enough probability. And if I don't find a collision, I'm fine, because I can define a pi tilde, and I can talk about its acceptance probability. So, of course, when I say a collision somewhere, in this word here somewhere, I'm hiding an argument that basically says that I will find one if I can't define a pi tilde. And this is the way you analyze the collision resistance of a Merkle tree from the collision resistance of a hash function. That the moment you can, if you can lie about the leaf, it is because you found a collision somewhere in the tree. Not necessarily the very bottom, but somewhere. Okay.
But let's consider a prover that just produces a convincing reply for the all zeros string.
Convincing what, sorry?
Convincing reply for the all zeros string of randomness.
Okay.
Then with 1 over poly t probability, the Verifier's random coins will be this all zero string, and hence the prover will succeed in convincing it.
Yeah.
But in that case, you cannot extract it, right? Because for all others, let's say it just aborts. It does not produce a convincing reply.
Sorry, but the all zero PCP, are you considering it as a good PCP for the verifier or not?
So let's say, so how do you extract a good PCP from such a prover?
But are you in that PCP system? Is the all zero PCP a good PCP?
R is all zeros.
So if, let's say R is all zeros,
Okay.
then the prover, let's say that I have a prover which produces a convincing reply.
Okay, let me just the very assumption that R spans a poly T space precludes small soundness error. You cannot achieve 2 to the minus lambda soundness error with such a small number of random strings.
Oh, so you're saying that the bit length of R is poly T, not the
No, I'm saying that the total space of R is poly T, but I cannot really expect that to be the case if I want a small soundness error. I need to kind of be a little bit more careful about how I'm doing this proof. So this is really a proof sketch, okay? And the reason why it's a proof sketch is because I'm assuming that I can go through all the random choices, okay? But
for some of these, the prover might not even produce a convincing reply, right?
yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, but that's in the delta here, right? So, like for some R's, they will just not lead to good things. That's fine. But the point is that there must be a fraction of R's that do lead to good PCP, lead to the verifier to accept, because otherwise I won't accumulate enough delta here.
Ali, actually, I think the confusion is a little different. In that, imagine a hypothetical situation where the verifier never queries the first character of pi, or of pi tilde.
Yeah, then you drop it, right?
The prover never needs to open the first character. Then you cannot, then how do you construct pi tilde?
You just drop, I mean, you
You could put anything there.
I can choose it arbitrarily.
you can choose it arbitrarily, for example. Yeah. Yeah, but in general, like, again, so you can either fill it in, like, it's kind of a, if you never query, it doesn't matter what's there, right? So,
But it's important that it's a property. Or is it important that it's a property of the PCP that I only need to recover a good fraction of the PCP to be able to recover the whole thing?
no, you just fill it in, because, like, if you never query it, then it cannot affect this probability, right? But there was a separate point, which is, I think Akshay is worrying about what happens, on if there is, like, specific random strings on which something strange happens. I want to say that, if you want the PCP to have soundness error 2 to the minus lambda, okay, you cannot also have randomness complexity log t. Okay, so this cannot coexist. Okay, so that's why right now I'm doing a simplifying a proof where I'm assuming that the bit complexity of R is log t. Now, if you want to see a proof that doesn't assume this, don't go to Kilian's paper. There's no proof of soundness. Instead, the argument that really shows this very carefully is in a much later paper. It's a very beautiful sort of security reduction in the Universal Arguments, a paper of Barak and Goldreich. It's actually non-trivial proof. It spans 4 or 5 pages, and it fixes. It kind of deals with this issue and it deals with other things that it's a local proof where you don't really have to touch all the R's. Essentially, what it does, it says you can wrap pi tilde into basically an oracle that gives you oracle access to pi tilde. And for any query to pi tilde, it has a sub-procedure to either produce a collision or give you an answer that is reasonable. It's actually non-trivial. And this is actually my point, actually. So thank you for bringing up these things. As strong as the intuition is for this protocol, properly proving it's secure is, I wouldn't say that easy, okay? Because you have to extract. In general, extraction arguments are rather subtle, okay? And here, the reason why this is not quite a proof is because we are assuming that I can see all the randomness R. Okay? And I think all this confusion, made my, not confusion, but questions, underlie my point, which is exactly that way. Okay? Yeah.
So in the construction of PCP, we actually had logarithmically many random points, right?
In yesterday's construction, yes. But if you want to drive the soundness error to be 2 to the minus lambda, you have to repeat the verifier some number of times. Okay, and you can use, yes, you can use expander efficient randomness amplification, but you will still have a lambda somewhere, right? And you cannot afford to go 2 to the lambda when you go over all possible random strings. Okay. So for constant soundness error, yes, you can get log t, but if you want small soundness error, then you have to pay for a lambda somewhere in the randomness complexity.
But why can't you just use parallel repetition afterwards?
Then we have to, I haven't thought about this over large alphabet. So
No, but parallel repetition for arguments we know works. So
then we need to think of this proof in the constant soundness error regime, which might work. I'm not going to try to do it standard.
what you just did?
It seems so, but you would need to kind of lay it out a bit more carefully.
It's a constant, right?
Yeah, but I think with high probability, maybe it's delta by 2 over there.
I don't think you need to do delta 2. I think you can do it well. Delta 2 is easy, but I think you can probably do this argument with random H also.
That sounds convincing. Okay, so just to make it explicit, the proposal is as follows. Consider a PCP with constant soundness error, where R indeed is log t bits. Do this proof, and then afterwards do parallel repetition, because this is a public coin argument, and parallel repetition kind of works nicely in arguments. But that would be like a slightly different construction, right? So, okay, good questions. And all of this is pointing to the fact that when you construct certain arguments, please prove them secure. Even very simple ones require a proof. Okay, so Kilian's protocol motivates a number of research directions, many of which have been investigated in a line of works. One of them was already highlighted before the break. Under what cryptographic assumptions can we build succinct arguments? So this shows that CRH suffices. As was pointed out earlier, later work shows us that MCRH suffices, multi-collision resistance. And so more generally, you can just ask, what are the cryptographic foundations of succinct arguments, either from specific assumptions or generic primitives. Another direction is about efficiency, which was also brought up as a question. The construction itself is efficient, but the PCP itself is, we don't know efficient PCP constructions. Rather, we know of efficient asymptotically PCP constructions. We can construct PCPs where, I'm going to use a different color. The state of the art in PCPs is actually pretty good asymptotically. You can make this poly T quasi-linear in T, which means T times some polylog T. You can also make the running time of the prover pretty close to the proof size. And so this is like, I think, like a really sort of powerful statement that we can construct PCPs that are this fast asymptotically. Unfortunately, the number of polylogs, logs and after that is rather big. And actually, I've been personally involved in trying to reduce the number of logs and implement some of these constructions. And I can say from personal experience that I do not think that our current understanding of PCPs today leads to any concrete efficiency. What people have been trying to do instead is to consider different models inspired by PCPs that will be probably discussed later in this program, where you can achieve even better asymptotics and more importantly, and also quite good concrete efficiency. Okay, and you can sort of build on some of the ideas of constructions such as these. I will not say much more about it because today is a mostly introductory talk, but let me say that understanding these foundations is very useful to understand the state of the art today. Okay, that's why we're focusing on foundations. A last question that it motivates is, what about around complexity? This is a 4-message public coin protocol, and now I would like to briefly motivate the sort of stronger goal of achieving non-interactive succinct arguments. Okay, and we'll spend the rest of today talking about how you get there based on this construction. I'm undecided what to delete here. Who votes for this board? It is the oldest, but few people are voting for it. Different suggestion of which board to go?
Is there one behind it?
People are concerned about the anonymity of this vote.
Okay, fine. So, executive decision, this board goes. Talk about so-called succinct, non-interactive arguments. There are also things called snargs. A succinct, non-interactive, and then arguments. It's better than snaz, right? So. So what does it mean? It means we would like to have something that roughly looks like this. We have, again, the big prover that gets A, Z, T, and W. And now instead of chit-chatting with the verifier, it just says, here's a very tiny proof I. It's a written down proof. And as before, the verifier is tiny. Okay, just the only thing that changes is that the interaction consists of a single message from the prover to the verifier. Now, the first realization when you entertain this goal is that it's obviously impossible. Why? Because since we're discussing arguments, okay, there are valid-looking proofs for false statements. So if this is what you're entertaining, a malicious prover could just show up and output a valid-looking proof for a false statement. It could just have been lucky, and it was born with it in its heart, and you can just output it.
Uniformly cannot say.
Sorry?
Because a uniform adversary.
Yeah, but no. Different story. Yeah, I'm not going to go into that right now. So before, this was not possible because, look, the first thing the verifier does is just injects randomness into the protocol. Okay? So here, we're going to consider actually a sort of standard cryptographic model that circumvents these issues. This is the notion of a reference string. Okay? So what you do is you instead assume there is some setup procedure that you can think about it at system setup, outputs a reference string. You can think about it just some parameters for everybody. that are then used by the prover and the verifier to respectively produce and validate proofs. Okay? And whatever useful information the prover was born with, it will be defeated by the fact that then the setup is run and the random string is sampled. The reference string is sampled. Okay? So this is, again,
This is so inherently different than the verifier sending a random string.
because we want something non-interactive. So of course we could say, verifier, please run the setup and send the reference string. But what we want is the reference string to sit up there, to be painted, in firmament, right? And everybody looks at it, and now messages are just non-interactive. You can always take the setup and ask the verifier to do it, but you will get something to message protocol. Okay? This is a standard model considering cryptography. For example, a similar issue shows up when you design non-interactive zero-knowledge proofs. You need something in the sky to help you, because zero-knowledge proofs, even without succinctness, just don't exist in a plain interactive world. Okay? So it's important to remember every snark has a setup. Okay? Despite what some people say. So now, why do we care so much about non-interactivity? Well, it has some advantages. One is, you can write it down for later use. So there's a question that when you interact with the prover and the verifier, you kind of need to be both online and talk to one another at the same time. Whereas when you have non-interactive proofs, you can really just write them down and store them somewhere, for example, in a blockchain or in a transaction, or you can send them over email, right? And then at a later time, whoever cares about it can look at it. And perhaps, another very important realization is that you kind of do the work once, and all others benefit. Namely, the prover that produced the snark is done. Anybody else can then check the proof. So in the interactive case, if you want to convince a lot of people, you have to go and talk individually which one of them. Okay? Here, you can just do this work once yourself, and you put it online. Okay? And then you can just look it up and check it. These two properties, or just general non-interactivity, are particularly suited for blockchain settings where one person makes the effort, puts it somewhere in a transaction in a blockchain, and then the rest of the network can sort of marvel at the proof, right? Without asking the prover to do any additional work. By the way, proving things is already hard work as is. Never mind if the prover has to keep doing it for every person that is interested. These are just, I'm not going to say much more about it. I think if it's not clear right now, it will become very clear in a few weeks when maybe you're exposed to some applications that decidedly rely on this non-interactivity. But now, let's say that this is our new goal, okay? And we want to fulfill this goal. And as always, it's easier to recycle what you already know rather than to start from scratch. So let's take what we have already built, this protocol, and try to go from there to here. Okay? So the first observation is that there's really no reason for in every interaction to resample a hash function. Okay? As long as the person sampling a hash function is not going to do anything sketchy, which it won't because it is the setup, we can just ask the setup to do it for us. Okay? And everybody is using the same hash function. Okay? So we can sort of go to 3 messages by asking setup to sample H for all to use. Okay? So that's progress, but 3 is still greater than 1, so we have to do something else. Okay? The next realization is that now that H is in the sky, let's see what is the verifier actually doing in interaction. Okay? So now the first message is that the prover sends the root. And then the verifier actually is not saying anything smart. He's just saying, here's some randomness. Right? So do we really need the verifier to be there? It's not that smart, okay? So here we come across, probably, the most beautiful and also hard to understand, analyze sort of paradigms in cryptography, which is called the Fiat-Shamir paradigm. The idea here is that we can replace the verifier outputting randomness with just some sufficiently strong cryptographic hash function invoked on RT. Okay, so let's kind of start to modify this protocol. If I want to do it in place, let's do it in place. What we're going to do is we're going to say introduce a new character. Okay, it's going to be a new type of hash function. I'm going to give it a different name because collision resistance is not what you're looking for. It's going to be a function f, okay, whose job is to be applied to RT in order to derive R. Okay, for now, just think about, let's say, SHA-256, okay? We need to say something a bit smarter than that, so we'll need to analyze it in a moment. But the point being is that now, delete this. Now we have a setup that does two things. It will sample H. It will sample F for some family that we need to talk about. And then it will kind of output those parameters for everybody to use. Now, if you notice, whatever the prover is doing here, it's all in his head. There's no verifier moving anywhere there. So the final proof that the verifier outputs, so the prover outputs, is going to be all the prover messages. So it's going to be RT, it's the first prover message, then pi sub q, the answers, and paths. So all of this is kind of in, all of this is in the prover's head. And what he outputs is this transcript. Okay? What the verifier does now is the prior checks, except that now the R that it will choose is set to be F on RT. Okay? It says, I'm going to derive the randomness depending on the root. Now, the intuition here is that if the prover in his head, he's trying to get a lucky random string that will let him cheat, what is he going to do? Well, if F is like a strong enough cryptographic hash function, the best thing he can do is to basically invoke F on a bunch of different RTs. Okay? But how many times can he do it? Not many times. It's basically analogous to thinking of many different PCPs and trying to run it against a random string in each of those cases. Okay? Or for the same PCP, maybe you kind of tweak a few locations and you try to resample the randomness for it. But it's not like you can actually choose the randomness. Now, all of this is just intuition. It's not anything formal about it. And in fact, this type of construction is very hard to understand. But we'll be able to analyze it at least in some idealized setting. I want to at least ask first the question, is syntactically what is going on here clear? We are realizing that the verifier was not doing much of anything in the protocol. All we needed was for randomness to show up at the right point in the protocol. And we do that by plugging in a hash function to generate it for us, depending on the things that should have come before. Okay? This is, again, like a very powerful and beautiful idea. It's actually used in practice for all kinds of other things. Yeah, I mean, it's just really, really cool idea. So, but now we should want to try to say something about this idea. So we'll say just a little bit about it. 10 minutes, that's not really, not a lot. So let me say what we can say about this idea, and I was hoping to analyze it, but I think maybe that was a little bit too. Right, so this is the previous proof. Doesn't apply right now. So intuitively, what we want is not quite collision resistance. We want the output of f to be unpredictable or to be like random looking. A good way to make it so is to let f be literally a random function. Okay? So we know, rather we can prove that if f is a random function, like literally a random function, then this works. What does it mean? Let me just at least write the statement that you can prove. Well, not prove it, but at least suppose there exists some efficient, let's call it P non-interactive, that makes Q queries to F and convinces V non-interactive of X with probability at least delta. Okay? Then there exists some efficient P tilde interactive. This is for the, say, for example, the 3-message protocol. That convinces there's no tilde here, the interactive of X with probability at least delta over Q. Okay? And maybe some negligible somewhere. So that's at least to be safe. So this is basically saying we can relate the security of the 3-message protocol to the security of the non-interactive protocol when we have plugged in f as a random function. Okay, so is the statement clear? There is a loss, by the way, and this is inherent. Can anybody give me some intuition for why this loss is here? So we will not see why this lemma is true, but we can certainly gain intuition for why a Q must be there. And I think that's kind of a starting point for the intuition of the proof. So what can a prover do that it cannot do during the interaction? During the interaction, he sends me the root, and I have it. It's in my pocket, right? I send him the R, and if he doesn't like it, tough luck, right? So that's the R I'm sending today. But when he does this in his head, he can experiment. He can say, here's a root, let's apply F. Here's an R. Do I like it or not? He says, I don't like it, let me try again. Okay? If he can make upwards of Q queries on F, he can gain an advantage, a multiplicative advantage of Q over the original soundness error, because it's as if he's playing that game against a verifier that is willing to resend randomness or to play that game upwards of Q times. Okay? So there is a loss, and it's here. But in the negligible setting of parameters, Q is going to be polynomial. So if this is non-negligible, this is polynomial. This is also going to be non-negligible. Okay? Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Random functions are not efficient. Okay? So the size of a random function is exponential. Okay? And this analysis relies on literally saying that f is random. Now, the study of how to relax the property of being a random function to more reasonable properties that we could potentially instantiate on concrete, say, complexity theoretic assumptions is a rather subtle and difficult endeavor in the sense that there are puzzle of positive and negative results that basically say that in general you can't hope to, if you really rely on the full thing being random, you can't hope to instantiate it, perhaps not surprisingly, but there are specific protocols where you can actually prove that specific bad, sort of nasty protocols where you really cannot instantiate it with anything, okay? And so you're trying to play in this game in between where you try to find natural protocols and natural properties that play game together to obtain a proof of security. Now, historically, actually, this protocol was not analyzed in this way. The idea of obtaining kind of the first snark was actually due to Micali. And his analysis and later papers that followed suit, so Micali and Valiant, so Micali is in 94 and Valiant in 08, actually considered the setting where both H and F are random. Okay? If H and F are random functions, then you can actually prove some very nice soundness error. Then the soundness error is something like Q times the soundness error of the PCP plus some order Q squared over 2 to the K. And this analysis is basically saying that if you're not just relying on collision resistance in the tree, but you let the tree also be sort of random functions everywhere, and you treat the hash functions as ideal objects, then you can write down actually a pretty explicit and nice expression that would let you set, for example, security parameters in practice. And we're not quite aware of, and this is actually tight. This Q here is the same Q that you see over here. And so, this particular construction kind of sits, you can try to analyze it either like this, by saying that the tree is CRH, and then the function is random. But then there are negative results that say that it's not so easy to make it not very random. Or you can say everything is random looking, and in practice, you actually do use potentially not just a CRH here, but SHA-256 everywhere. Okay? And then you are kind of maybe believe more that the type of security you get is this one. Okay?
K, you have to define K in that case, which is the output.
Yes, sorry. So K is the output length of H and F. So H and F are functions from 2 to K to K. And precisely these difficulties have motivated people to study the construction of succinct non-interactive arguments in completely different ways. And some of these we will see in the first workshop. That basically, if you don't use PCPs and you use other objects related to PCPs, for example, something called linear interactive proofs, you can try to bring to bear other types of cryptography and try to avoid using random functions that in cryptography we call random oracles. Nonetheless, from a practical perspective, all of these constructions are pretty solid in practice, and they bring to practice quite different trade-offs in terms of proof size, proof efficiency, and some of these will be highlighted, for example, in the first workshop.
So the setup here is an index to the hash function to show?
Yes. For example, if you were to think of in the random oracle model, you think of the setup as the choice of a random function, or in the real world, you can think about the initialization vector for whatever general purpose cryptographic hash function you're using. The main point that I want you to take away today is that if you're interested in how to construct a succinct argument or a succinct non-interactive argument, it's actually not that difficult once you assume the PCP theorem away. Like, here's the picture of a PCP. It's not complicated, right? Here's a 4-message public coin argument, right? And here's how you collapse it to a non-interactive argument. It's really sort of a sort of beautiful couple of constructions, and I think it should be helpful to kind of keep them in your head. Other constructions, succinct arguments that you might see later in this semester might be less simple. But that's fine because they achieve other things, either in cryptographic assumptions or in efficiency. But this is a good starting point to keep in mind. Yes?
So when you go to practice, and particularly if you want to analyze things concretely, the soundness error issue becomes quite relevant. So you said one approach is using Verifier, but they use this error correcting code, which I assume practical constructions don't apply to.
Yeah, so the way I would use something like this in practice, I would actually instantiate both H and F using a general purpose hash function. I would not go as far as making H just a CRH by design. I would say, look, H and F are both SHA-256, and then you look at this one, and this is pretty good. Like, this is pretty good. Now, in practice, the PCP will get in the way, but there are other constructions that are sort of Killian's, that are sort of, you can replace the PCP with something called interactive oracle proofs, that we'll maybe talk about some other time in the semester, and then you get similar behavior, and then you set parameters according to this type of expressions. Analyzing the concrete security loss of Barak and Goldreich, I think it's interesting.
The point here is you also do this extra correcting code, so that doesn't seem to make sense. Like the PCP becomes much bigger already.
Yeah, but you could still ask, what is the concrete security law?
Extra leveraging or prior repetition might be better.
Yeah, I really don't know which of these options makes most sense in practice. In practice, I would really just stick with this. The motivation to try to understand that direction would be to say, well, I have reasons for why I really, really want the H to be a CRH and not a general purpose hash function because it makes my life easier in other ways. And then you would need to pick one of these directions to try to understand concrete security.
There are correcting codes in the Barak Goldberg paper were only used to replace quasi-poly hash functions in the previous paper by poly hash functions.
Sure, but quasi-poly will still also have an overhead in terms of concrete security because you need to pick a security parameter and so on. So it all has, right?
Yeah, it's complicated. Okay. More questions on this?
Security, then you can pick a security parameter.
I have one question. So
yes.
This argument by nature was like an efficient polynomial time extraction. So all these, even though we didn't want an argument of knowledge, it seems like a kind of the method out of the box gives a argument of knowledge. Is it kind of a deeper reason that whatever we do, it always ends up being? Because it seems we have to do an efficient argument here.
It's a great question. Somehow extraction plays a role every time you prove even soundness of a succinct argument because it's succinct and you need to kind of recover the rest of the thing that you have reducing to. And it's an unfortunate state of affairs because sometimes in other parts of cryptography, just proving soundness as opposed to proof of knowledge is a feature. Here, you can gain a little bit. For example, in the previous proof, you can just say there exists an H such that blah, 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 and you get a little bit in the tightness of the security reduction, as opposed to pick a random H and then see what happens. But I'm not aware of more fundamental gains that you can get.
You should pick it up because we wanted to also use the collision resistant hash. Like you had that item 1, and then you couldn't fix the first message inefficiently either. So the whole kind of extraction process should remain still.
Actually, yes. I could not have picked it existentially because it could have been one of the bad ones. Yeah. So, yeah, that's a good point. Which means that the previous proof was still a sketch.
In the theorem as you wrote, the proof will use H and F being independent of each other? Or?
It's not necessary, but for example, it is convenient to do some domain separation. So you can either pick the same random function and then kind of fix the first. Yeah. But
in the analysis,
in analysis, it's convenient. In analysis, it's convenient to think as different random functions for the ones that extract randomness for the Fiat-Shamir style thing, and a different hash function for building Merkle trees. It is convenient to think about them separately. Right, so I think it's lunchtime. I'll stay here to answer more questions, but otherwise, thank you. We resume at 2 with 0 and 2.